Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
When I was a little girl, I remember this song by John Lennon called Imagine. It was a huge hit. Everyone was singing it, thinking how we can make a brotherhood of man, just to imagine a better society where there's no possessions. I want to read you a few of those lyrics to see how beautiful this song was. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will be as one. It goes on and talks about how there's going to be a brotherhood of man, a world with no possessions because people will be sharing them. It was only later on when I grew up and I realized what this song really was about. And it was about communism, where no one owns anything. It belongs to the collective. And therefore, there's nothing to kill or die for, nothing to steal from anyone. And it sounds logical. It sounds doable, but it has never been successful in practice. It's a fantasy. Not even God, who created the world, wanted a communistic system for us. He gave people property and land, and yet we want to defy God. We know better. We're going to build a tower into heaven, and we're going to dethrone God, and we're going to become the masters of our own destiny, and we're going to do things our way. And we see the countries that did things our way: Venezuela, Cuba, the Soviet Union, Russia, Vietnam, and Korea, and all of these places where it has been a huge failure. And now we want to bring something even akin to this to America, to make a new reset button, to spread and divide and redistribute the wealth. This cannot work. On the show today, I'll be interviewing people who lived in the Soviet Union, and they're going to share their lives and memories with us of what it was to live in this utopia. Don't go anywhere.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
All right, we're back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com, and we're doing this show in order to try to give us a better understanding of what it's really like to live under a socialist left type of government, where the idea of people sharing things or maybe not even owning anything anymore, that this would just be a utopia. And our guest today is someone who grew up in the Soviet Union, and she's going to be sharing her experiences with us. Her name is Leah Aharoni. If the name sounds familiar, it's because you've heard her on our new show called News from the Torah. She's the host of that. It airs every Sunday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern time. You're going to want to listen to that show. It's amazing. It's already got great reviews. She's also the founder of LoveYour.biz, B-I-Z. Welcome to the show, Leah Aharoni.
Hello, Tamara. Thank you for having me.
All right. You grew up in the Soviet Union. Give us approximately what year that was, what years those were, and how it was growing up under a socialist government, communist government.
Okay, so I was born in 1975 in Moscow in the Soviet Union, and my family left Soviet Union in 1989, right right around the time the country fell apart. What is it growing up like? I'm still dealing with the trauma 30 years after. It's a very tough life. It's a very tough life on many levels. So first of all, you need to understand that growing up in Russia, you could not walk into a store and just buy food. It's as simple as that. My parents were well off, and they tried to work on the side, and they had great connections. So my mother would literally go from one grocery store manager to another and buy the food that was brought in small supply and left in the back room for people with connections. And none of that food was making its way to the front of the store where ordinary citizens were buying, because if they send 5 pounds of salami that day, so that wasn't enough for the 500,000 people that were buying from that store. So it was reserved for somebody. Basically, socialism doesn't work as an economic system. It just doesn't. And the social experiment has been done 3 times. The 2 countries that started out as one country with a uniform culture was split into 2, into a socialist state and a capitalist state, and then were given 50 years to try that out. So one is Germany. In 1945, after the war, Germany was split into 2 countries, the capitalist Germany, the Western Germany, and Eastern Germany. And Western Germany did so much better. Eastern Germany basically collapsed after 50 years of this. The second one, North and South Korea, same thing. Since 1950s, we've had 2 Koreas, and South Korea is doing amazing, and North Korea is hell on earth. And the third time, it was done in Israel, the kibbutzim. The kibbutz movement started 100 years ago, was supposed to be a socialist/communist state, mini community. And the kibbutzim hardly lasted 50, 60 years, and they basically all went bankrupt. So the experiment has been done. It doesn't work.
Now, what about all the people who are saying, we're not going to be the Soviet Union, we're not going to be communist, we're going to be like Sweden?
Sweden has the highest freedom, not the highest, but one of the highest freedom indices in the world. Sweden is actually much more capitalist than the United States is, and the freedom of business is much greater there. So no, we're not going to be like Sweden. United States are not going to be like Sweden. That's not where it's going. You need to understand that, for example, if the government is paying for your education, then the government decides what kind of education you're going to get. If the government decides that you're getting free medicine that you don't pay for, then the government decides what medicine you get, and you don't have other choices. Whenever you sign away your freedom to something, then somebody's going to make those decisions for you. So the question is, do you want somebody else to make those decisions for you?
I don't understand exactly, again, why America couldn't be like Sweden. Tell the Americans why.
Because Swedish economic system is actually much freer and much more relaxed, with much less legislation than American. So in that sense, the difference between capitalism and socialism is how you run the market, who owns the market, and who legislates the market, and how much regulation there is in the marketplace. On the one hand, in the socialist regime, basically the state owns the market. The state owns the tools of production. In a capitalist regime, what you have is a free market where we have people, entrepreneurs building businesses, and the government regulates them to the least extent necessary to ensure that everything works. Okay? So this is the basic difference between capitalism and socialism. Sweden has a much freer market and a much freer business environment than the United States does today. So Sweden is not a socialist example. They have very high taxation, for example, but the regulation of the market is much freer.
So could America be like Sweden if it wanted to, changing its laws?
I don't think so. Sweden is a country of 10 million people, and it's pretty homogeneous. And, just now in the past decade, they've had an influx of Muslims, for example. That's a different kind of population with a different kind of culture, and they're not managing. The United States is a huge country with very different kind of populations in every sense. Growing up in Iowa, living in Iowa is not like living in New York. It's not even the same culture. It's not the same mind space. So I don't think you need a different kind of governance, and you cannot have a one size fit all kind of governance that you're going to have under socialism. I don't think it's going to work.
So why did your family leave the Soviet Union?
Because it was hell on earth. I mean, who wants to live there? It was so hellish that they wouldn't let you out. You couldn't, if you wanted to take vacation abroad, you couldn't go as a whole family. You had to leave somebody back as a hostage. So my parents wanted to travel to Hungary, which is also a socialist state. And they had to leave me, it was my grandparents, as a hostage to make sure they come back. It was so bad they wouldn't let anybody out. And look, I remember growing up, since literally, as far back as I can remember myself, you could not speak freely. Everybody and everything had ears and eyes. You could not repeat anything that was said outside the house, inside the house, outside the house. You never knew which neighbor of yours is going to inform on you. And that was like everyday things, And
what did they get by informing on a neighbor?
Some of them were just KGB operatives, and you never knew who was one. And sometimes they were jealous or spiteful, or you didn't do something they wanted you to do, and that's how they would get back at you. And sometimes, they wanted to ingratiate themselves to somebody, all the wrong reasons why people do wrong things. So I grew up knowing that my phone is tapped, that you cannot say anything on the phone. You cannot trust anybody, except for your most inner circle, because, we literally, one day my father opened the front door to throw out the garbage. We had a little party in our house, and he found the next door neighbor bending over with his ear to our keyhole, listening, eavesdropping on what's going on in the house. So,
wow. That is amazing. All right. In the last 2 minutes that we have left for the interview, what do you want to leave our listeners with? What warning? What wisdom?
Okay. So thought police that's happening right now in the United States is unacceptable. It's the first step towards losing your freedom. I understand that it's very, very annoying to have people who think differently than you. They're not all domestic terrorists, and they should not be banned, and they should be able to speak freely. And just like I said on my show today, there's a great line from a prominent German pastor from before the Holocaust. First they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak up because I was a socialist. They came for the communists. I didn't speak up. I wasn't a communist. They came for the Jews. I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak out. If there's one thing we'll learn from Soviet Union, is when some people lose freedom of speech, those who cheer will be next. Okay, so if you let some of your compatriots lose their freedom of speech today, I promise you, in 5 years, you will look back and say, no, I cannot speak freely anymore. So freedom of speech is such an important principle. It sounds so counterintuitive. You cannot shut people up. When you shut them up, they blow up, and it's much more dangerous. That's number one. And number two, you will be next in line. And this has happened in every tyrannic regime around the world. And, we need to be blind not to take this lesson from history.
And one last question, Leah. When you were growing up, did you have your own apartment? Your family, did they live in an apartment or a house of their own?
My family lived in an apartment that was part of a cooperative. It's a group of people that sort of got together, and there was a cooperative apartment. There was no private property in Russia. You did not own anything besides the clothes on your back. Everything else belonged to the state. So nobody owned anything, and nobody could work anywhere besides working for the state. And you see,
and what about your parents? Did they when they grew up, were they sharing an apartment?
Yes, my father was born in an apartment, in a 10-room apartment. Listen to this: 10 rooms, 10 families, one toilet, one kitchen. Okay, he was one of
Unbelievable.
3 kids in a 100 square feet room. Okay, so this is how my father grew up, and then they were really spoiled by the state, and then 5 people moved into a 2-room apartment that they got from the state.
Unbelievable. We have to stop here. I wish we can go on. Leah Aharoni, thank you so much for being with us and giving us a warning that we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamar.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
We are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Our guest now is Alexander Boot. He's a British writer of Russian descent. He's the author of several books on politics and knows Russia intimately, having been born and raised there and eventually chased out by the KGB when it was the Soviet Union. And he's going to be sharing with us what it was like growing up and living under a socialist government. And you can check out his political commentary blog at alexanderboot.com. Welcome to the show, Alexander Boot.
Well, happy to be here.
It's good to have you on. All right. So very briefly, the youth of today in the West, many of them have come to believe that a great reset would be great for the world, the redistribution of wealth, having everything shared, maybe not even owning any property at all. And this would bring a utopia. It would end racism. It would even out the wealth for all, and everything would just be hunky-dory. I'd like you to straighten them out as someone who lived under a socialist government, what it was really like.
Well, it was miserable. Actually, the amount of misery in the country is directly proportionate to the amount of socialism in it. The more socialist, the more miserable, because the one I lived in was at the extreme end of socialism, and the living conditions in every respect were inhuman. I mean, I don't mean just the economic aspect of it, not just the physical aspect of it, but everything, intellectual, spiritual, aesthetic, lived in extreme ugliness and extreme poverty. And that's considering that my family was relatively well off by Soviet standards, and yet when I was born, 7 of us lived in one room in the communal flat with 5 other families, all sharing the same facilities.
So you had 7 families living in one apartment.
Six families. 6
families living in one apartment. You shared the bathroom. Each one of you had your own room, but it wasn't each one of you. It was each family had their own room in the apartment.
Yes. Our room was broken into 3 with curtains. And one generation of the family lived in one little cubicle, the other in another one, and I had my own. But curtains are not very good for sound installation.
So I want our listeners to understand this. So when your parents wanted to be together and have children, there was only a sheet or a curtain separating their bed from your bed, which was all in the same bedroom.
Yes.
Of an apartment.
It was a lot of fun for somebody with voyeuristic tendencies.
Oh my goodness. All right. Okay. And this was normal to you. Now, so I want to ask you to tell our listeners what your father did for a living. And if it was dependent, I imagine that if your father had a more important job, he would get better conditions. But tell us very briefly about
Well,
that.
my father had a very, very important job indeed. He ran an engineering company with 800 people working for him. I mean, if the same kind of job anywhere in the West would have made him a wealthy man. But that made no difference, really. I mean, my uncle, for many, until he actually managed to buy his own flat, my uncle was a member of the Academy of Science in Russia, which is about as high as it goes in the scientific establishment. And he lived in conditions even worse than ours when I was little. You know, so
Well, what is worse than what's worse than that? Tell our listeners.
well, I'll tell you what's worse than that. What's worse than that is a so-called corridor system.
A what?
A corridor system. When you have a long corridor, maybe 60, 70 meters long, and with maybe 30 rooms along the corridor, and all those people also had just one kitchen and one bathroom. And I had relations who lived like that. And I remember when I was little, I loved that corridor because I could ride my tricycle there. But the conditions were even worse than ours. We were comparatively well off by Soviet standards, you understand. And the people who lived noticeably better than us were the party officials. They lived extremely well by Soviet standards again, but people who did normal jobs, no matter how high up they were, most of them lived in appalling conditions.
And this was Soviet life. I'm surprised that the people didn't rebel sooner.
Well, it's difficult to rebel when the regime murdered 60 million of its own citizens in the 74 years that it was in existence.
Tell our listeners about that.
Well, I mean, there's ample literature on that subject. And obviously, when a tyranny like the Bolshevik socialist tyranny in Russia is imposed on the people, they resist. And the only way to quell that resistance is by violence. So immediately, practically the first thing they did, the Soviets, when they took over in 1917, they started a chain of concentration camps, which idea the Germans then gratefully borrowed.
And I understand that many of these millions of people that were killed were also starved to death.
Yeah, that was the case. And actually, everybody knows, or people who follow Russia know, about the great artificial famine of 1932-1933, when they deliberately starved at least 5 million people. But there was another famine when I was born in 1947, 1948, of a smaller scale, but at least 1.5 million people died of starvation.
So I understand that the government, of course, took over all the land, took over the farms, took over the running of the farms. And since the farm didn't belong to anyone individually and it was owned by the state, that people didn't really care as much. And these farms eventually failed. They didn't bring forth the produce that it needed to, and people were starving. Is that true?
Well, that's absolutely true. Yes, I mean, Russia went from being the top exporter of grain before the revolution to being the top importer of grain in the 1960s when I lived there, and when Khrushchev was buying grain in America and Canada. And yes, it's eventually to stop the exodus of peasants from the land into the cities, the Soviets introduced a version of serfdom where the collective farmers, the peasants, didn't have any travel documents, so they had to stay put, attached to the land, and could only travel with official permission. It was a form of slavery, actually.
Amazing. And in the last 2 minutes that we have, I want you to talk to the youth of today and the people who think that socialism is such a great idea. They think it's going to be like living in Sweden or something like that. I want you to warn them what could happen.
Well, what I lived through as a child and a young man is probably the extreme end of what can happen. Things don't have to be quite as bad as that, but they always are bad. Whenever, as I say, the more socialist the country, the worse they are. And the new American administration, which is unapologetically socialist, is going to destroy the country. How badly, we'll see. And but it won't take very long, I don't think. I doubt it will get to the point of being like the Soviet Union that I remember. In fact, I'm certain it won't. But there are different degrees of catastrophe.
What about those who say, well, we're not going to be like the Soviet Union, as you just said. We're going to be like Sweden.
Well, everybody says those things until the socialists actually take over. It's the oldest mantra in politics. You know, when we take over, we'll do it differently. But somehow nobody does. Sweden is a small country. I mean, it's and with a homogeneous population, it's much, and with a tremendous work ethic. It's much easier to do such experiments there. But even in Sweden, they abandoned most of the socialist policies in the last couple of decades because Sweden was hurting. But
so it wouldn't be able to sustain itself if it continued that way.
Well, not in any recognizable form. Not like the United States has been over the last few decades. I mean, things will get very bad, and not just economically. I mean, the freedom of expression will suffer tremendously, as it always does under socialists. Well, you can already see that in this woke and diktats and all those, you know, Black Lives Matter pogroms that will be encouraged by the Biden administration. And so on and so forth, all those identity politics, all this nonsense, you know, this is going to get worse.
Wow.
You know,
we're going to have to leave it there. I'm so sorry. We've run out of time. Alexander Boot, thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us what it was like. Again, people can go to his website at alexanderboot.com. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany is but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
We are back here at the Tamar Yonah Show on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. And again, what was it like to live under a quote unquote utopian socialist communist type of government? A place where it was going to be imagined, like John Lennon said, nobody owns anything. We're all brothers and sisters. We share. Let's find out how it works in real life and not just in someone's head or in some song lyrics. Welcome to the show, Masha.
Hi, Tamar. Nice to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. So tell us where you grew up and what it was like.
Okay, I grew up in Kiev. It was a capital of Ukraine back then, still under Soviet Union, and pretty much they wanted to make us like cows, all the same, do what you're said, like no personality. Starting with the daycare, you came, it's like time to have coffee. All the kids go to have coffee. Okay, reading the books. Everybody read the book. Go to the restroom. Doesn't matter you want or not. You're put, on the toilet, and you must do something. So, and it was all of it like that, and the dogma was installed in our heads that you need to be like everybody else and to do what the party tells you to do, and everything like in my head is so gray, it's like no colors. It's like pictures of that time. It's no colors. Everything was very doomed, and you just knew what is going to happen next day. And from the very early age, I heard at home, like, don't tell anybody what you hear at home. Don't tell anybody what happens at home. And nothing happened. People might come, and tell something, just what they heard through the Call Israel or whatever.
The Voice of Israel.
News.
Well, what were your parents afraid of, that people would know that went on inside their house, that they could be reported?
Because I was born like a few years after the Second World War finished. It was a couple of years after Stalin era. People were still afraid because people were telling on each other. The hero was some young boy, Pavlik Morozov, who was telling on his father, and it was like a national hero, and it was just.
Wait, so a child reported his own father, and then he was presented in the community or in the country like a national hero, you're saying?
Yes, in the country, it was books about him, and everybody knew his name, and it was, and it's.
What did his father do that the kid reported him?
I think he was. He had like extra cow or something, like was extremely rich, so to speak.
So his father had an extra cow that he wasn't allowed by the government.
I don't remember exactly what it was, but something like that,
Wow.
It's not that his father murdered somebody or did some horrific sin. No, just
And let me ask you this: somebody who had a baby. You want to be home with your baby. You want to raise your kids, or at least for the first few years. What were the rules? Was a woman who had a child allowed to stay home and be with her baby, or was she forced back to work? What was it like in the Soviet Union?
No, actually, it was pretty good about that. It's the woman was allowed to stay for a year home with the baby. Okay, and still have the job when she comes back. Okay.
If she wanted to stay home for 2 years, 3 years, was she allowed to?
No.
And what would happen to her baby at 1 year old? Who did she have to give her baby to?
She gives her to the child care.
Mm-hmm.
So the government would raise the baby, and it's like all the rhymes and stuff. It's just glorifying Communist Party and Lenin, and how it will be good, and it's already good, and we're the best country in the world, and it just all this lies. We had a joke later that if you need to fill up your fridge, you just open the fridge doors and turn on the TV, and they will tell you how we have everything, and it's like no problem. It's very nice to live in Soviet Union. So a lot of people unfortunately believed in it, and some people already knew that it's propaganda and it's lie, but people were afraid because it was right after Stalin era. But
Tell our listeners the joke about the two major newspapers in Russia, which was Pravda and Izvestia.
So the two major newspapers were Pravda, which is truth, and Izvestia, which is news. And the joke was that what is the difference, that Pravda didn't have Izvestia, and Izvestia didn't have the Pravda. Which,
right.
Like,
so the news didn't have the truth in it, and the truth didn't have the news in it.
Have a news.
All right.
And it was, everything was very good. We had no hurricanes, no earthquakes, like the best country, like utopia, is like.
In other words, you were lied to constantly by the government, and you were expected to pretend that you believe these lies.
Right.
That's kind of like today with the gender people. You have to pretend to believe that a man is a woman if he says he's a woman, and you just say yes, yes, yes. Okay, kind of interesting. And what about your living conditions? I mean, you said that the refrigerators weren't always full. It was hard, but what was it like sleeping wise? Did you have your own home to sleep in, or did you share it with another family?
No. Well, it was after the war, and Kiev was all in ruins. So we had it was a nice apartment before that one family lived in before the war, and my grandparents was my mother and her brother came in. They occupied like one room, and then another family occupied another room. It was like 4 rooms and a kitchen. So each room was occupied by a separate family, which like it was my grandmother, my uncle, my father, mother, and I, all in one room. And it was very similar in all other rooms. And it was one big kitchen and one restroom. And everybody was turning their own light bulb when would go to the restroom. Okay, and everybody were watching that. God forbid you didn't turn their lights or didn't use their seat when you went to the restroom. And
so people brought their own light bulbs to the restroom.
Yes, and people were asked to tell on each other. And I watched not too long ago a movie, and the former KGB agent said that every third, like if there was a gathering of more than 3 people, for sure one of them was like an agent for the KGB.
Wow.
So people were telling on each other, like in Vietnam and China. It's an awful regime.
In
and
20 seconds, Masha, tell our younger generation why socialism and the leftist agenda is not a good idea. 20 seconds.
First of all, it's utopia. It's unnatural. The matter that everybody gets what they need and everybody gives what they can. It doesn't work. Okay, like if you work more than somebody, you're expected to receive more. Okay, and it just doesn't work that way. And unfortunately, United States, when 30 years ago I went there, I already saw that it's going that way, and unfortunately I was right. And it's very, very, very sad what's going on there. And unfortunately, children in school were taught to tell on each other and tell on their parents. About 15 years ago, I already know of my nephews who were asked to tell on one another.
Masha, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure and my honor. Thank you, Tamar.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.